It started with the sound of chainsaws in the distance. At first, I thought it was just the usual noise of the neighborhood, the hum of someone trimming their hedges, maybe a crew clearing out a fallen branch after last night's storm. But then I heard the unmistakable crack of wood splintering, followed by a deep, groaning creak that sent a chill down my spine. Something wasn't right. I set down my coffee and stepped outside, my heartbeat quickening as I followed the sound. And that's when I saw it. My tree, my 100-year-old oak, the one that had stood tall in my backyard for as long as I had owned this house, was being cut down. A crew of men, all wearing bright orange safety vests, were hacking away at the trunk like it was just another day on the job. And standing right there, supervising the entire operation with an air of entitlement so thick it could suffocate, was Karen, my next-door neighbor, the self-proclaimed queen of the cul-de-sac. I could hardly process what I was seeing. The massive oak, which had provided shade, history, and life to my yard, was now leaning at an unnatural angle, its thick roots straining against the soil, as if resisting the inevitable. For a moment, I stood frozen in place, disbelief rooting me to the ground. Then, fury took over. I stormed across the yard, my voice sharp and demanding. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The workers barely acknowledged me, continuing their reckless job, but Karen turned, a smirk creeping across her face as she folded her arms. "Oh, relax," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I did you a favor. That tree was an eyesore, and besides, the branches were hanging over my yard. Technically, I had every right. Technically." I could feel the rage boiling in my chest. This wasn't a branch trimming. This wasn't some minor landscaping dispute. This was my property, my tree, and she had taken it upon herself to destroy it without even a word of warning. "You had no right," I snapped, stepping closer. "That tree was on my land, and you didn't even ask." She sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes like I was some overreacting child. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It was going to fall eventually. I just took care of it before it became a problem." The arrogance. The sheer audacity. My fingers clenched into fists, but before I could say another word, another sharp crack echoed through the air. The workers paused, exchanging uneasy glances. The massive oak groaned, its weight shifting unnaturally, and in that second, I knew something was terribly, horribly wrong. And then, it happened. With a final, deafening crack, the entire tree gave way. Not toward my yard. Not toward the open street. But toward Karen's house. For the briefest moment, there was silence. A pause in time where even the air seemed to hold its breath. Then, with an earth-shaking crash, the tree slammed into the roof of Karen's pristine, overpriced McMansion. Tiles shattered. Wood splintered. The second-story balcony, once a place where she stood sipping her overpriced wine, collapsed under the weight of the branches. Dust and debris exploded into the air as the entire house seemed to shudder from the impact. Karen's mouth fell open, her face draining of color. The workers stood frozen, chainsaws still in their hands. And I? I simply watched. Because karma, as it turned out, had a sense of timing so perfect, it almost felt orchestrated. Karen stood motionless, eyes wide with shock as the reality of what had just happened settled in. Her perfectly curated suburban dream had turned into a nightmare in a matter of seconds. The massive oak, which she had so arrogantly ordered to be cut down, now lay across the entire side of her house, crushing her pristine white fence, shattering windows, and caving in the roof. Dust and debris drifted into the air, mixing with the sound of alarms blaring from inside her home. The workers, who had just moments ago been so confident in their task, were now stumbling backward, muttering to each other in hushed, panicked voices. One of them grabbed a phone, no doubt calling their supervisor, while another just stood there, shaking his head like he had foreseen this disaster but had been powerless to stop it. Karen's silence didn't last long. The initial shock melted into a furious, desperate rage as she spun around, her manicured hands trembling. She pointed at the wreckage as if willing it to undo itself, her breathing shallow and erratic. Then, her gaze snapped to me, and I saw it, the shift from denial to blame. She advanced toward me, her face contorted with fury, but I didn't move. I didn't have to. Because no matter how much she wanted to make this my fault, we both knew the truth. She had done this. Her arrogance, her entitlement, her inability to respect boundaries, this was all on her. But of course, Karen would never admit to that. Her mind worked fast, desperate to twist the situation into a version that suited her. I could already see the accusations forming behind her furious eyes. But before she could unleash them, before she could start screaming about how this was somehow my doing, another voice cut through the chaos. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Someone must have called emergency services, maybe one of the workers, maybe a concerned neighbor who had witnessed the disaster unfold. Whatever the case, the flashing red and blue lights soon filled the street as a fire truck, a police cruiser, and an ambulance pulled up in front of our homes. The first responders wasted no time. Firefighters rushed toward the wreckage, assessing the structural damage, while the police officer on duty made his way straight for us. His gaze flicked between Karen, who was now borderline hysterical, and me, standing still as stone, watching it all unfold. Karen turned on the officer like a woman possessed, waving her arms in wild gestures as she tried to explain her twisted version of events. She pointed at me, spewing nonsense about how I had refused to cut down a dangerous tree, how I had neglected my responsibility, how she had to take matters into her own hands for the safety of the neighborhood. But even as she spoke, her voice dripping with forced concern, her eyes kept darting toward the wreckage, as if she couldn't quite believe what had happened herself. The officer listened, his expression unreadable, letting her ramble on until she finally ran out of breath. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze to me, silently asking for my side of the story. I didn't have to yell. I didn't have to argue. I simply stated the facts. The tree was mine. It had stood strong for decades, perfectly healthy, posing no risk to anyone. Karen had made the unilateral decision to have it removed without my permission, without any legal right to do so. I had not been consulted, I had not been warned, and when I tried to intervene, she dismissed me as if my own property didn't belong to me. And now, thanks to her reckless actions, the very thing she had sought to prevent had happened, but instead of falling onto my property, the tree had chosen poetic justice. It had taken down hers instead. The officer's expression didn't change, but I could tell he understood. His gaze shifted back to Karen, whose outrage faltered just slightly under the weight of the truth. The firefighters finished their initial assessment and confirmed what was already obvious: the structural damage to her home was significant. The weight of the fallen tree had cracked the upper supports of the house, making it unsafe to enter. Repairs would not be simple. They would not be cheap. And they would not be my problem. Karen's frustration reached a boiling point. She demanded that I be held responsible, that I pay for the damages, that I somehow make this right. But the officer remained unmoved. His voice was calm, measured, but firm. The tree had been on my property. She had no legal authority to remove it. The moment she took action without my consent, she had assumed full responsibility for whatever consequences followed. That was the law. That was the reality. And there was nothing she could do to change it. Karen's mouth opened and closed, searching for something, anything, to argue. But there was no argument left to make. Her expensive mistake had just cost her more than she had ever anticipated. And for the first time since I had known her, she had no one to blame but herself. Karen stood frozen, her entire body trembling as she absorbed the weight of her actions. The officer's words had cut through whatever delusion she had built around herself, leaving only the cold, undeniable truth. She had tried to exercise control over something that wasn't hers, and in doing so, she had ruined everything. The damage to her house was extensive, worse than she had probably even realized in her blind panic. From where I stood, I could see the splintered wooden beams, the shattered windows, the deep indentations where the branches had crushed the upper structure. The front door had been rendered useless, the frame warped from the impact, while parts of the roof had caved in, leaving jagged edges of exposed insulation and broken tiles littering the front lawn. The firefighters were speaking in hushed tones, but their expressions said everything. This was going to be a disaster to fix. The neighborhood had taken notice. People who had been inside their homes, enjoying their afternoon, were now standing on their porches, peering from behind fences, or gathering in small clusters on the sidewalk. I could see the mix of expressions, some in shock, others in barely concealed amusement. Karen had spent years playing the role of the self-appointed community watchdog, enforcing rules, filing complaints over the most trivial things, making people's lives miserable with her constant need for control. And now, standing there, watching her own house reduced to a broken mess, she had become the center of attention in the worst possible way. There was something almost poetic about it. The officer, after ensuring that Karen understood the legal implications of what had happened, walked away to speak with the firefighters and gather the necessary reports. Karen didn't move. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her face a twisted mask of disbelief. I could see her brain working, trying to piece together some kind of exit strategy, some loophole that would get her out of this, but there wasn't one. The consequences of her actions were final. She turned her gaze toward me, her eyes filled with a desperate kind of rage, as if she still believed this could somehow be my fault. But there was nothing left to say. The law was not on her side. Neither was fate. The workers she had hired to cut the tree were long gone, slipping away the moment the situation had spiraled beyond their control. They had done what they were paid for, but they wanted no part in the disaster that followed. That left Karen standing alone in the wreckage of her own making. The realization must have hit her all at once because her shoulders slumped, her breath coming out in sharp, ragged bursts. This wasn't just about her house. This was about her pride, her reputation, the carefully curated image she had built over the years. All of it, crushed under the weight of a tree she never had the right to touch. The fire chief finally approached her, his face neutral but firm as he explained the full extent of the damage. The house was not safe to stay in. The structure had been compromised, and until it was inspected and repaired, she would need to find alternative living arrangements. The words hit her like a slap. Karen had always lorded over this neighborhood, treating her house as a monument to her own self-importance. And now, she was being told she couldn't even stay in it. I could see her jaw tighten, her hands balling into fists at her sides, but there was no arguing with reality. She had made this mess. Now she had to live with it. The minutes stretched on, the commotion slowly dying down as the authorities finished their assessments. The officer returned, handing Karen a folder of documents outlining the next steps, legalities, insurance claims, property violation notices. It was a mountain of paperwork that she would have to deal with, a mess that would take months to sort out. As the realization set in, her face changed. The rage didn't disappear, but it dulled, replaced by something else. Exhaustion. Defeat. Without another word, she turned away from me and walked toward her car. Her steps were slow, hesitant, like someone carrying a weight far too heavy for them. She didn't even acknowledge the neighbors who were still watching, whispering amongst themselves. She just got into her vehicle, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, and stared ahead, unmoving. I wondered if she was replaying everything that had led up to this moment, if she was finally understanding the consequences of her arrogance. Or maybe she was just trying to figure out who else she could blame, even now. The officer, after ensuring that everything was under control, gave me a nod before heading back to his patrol car. I didn't need to ask what would happen next, I already knew. Karen would fight this, try to twist it into something it wasn't, but it wouldn't work. The facts were too clear, the evidence too overwhelming. This was the kind of mistake that didn't just go away. The damage was done. As the emergency vehicles pulled away, the neighborhood slowly began to return to normal. People drifted back into their homes, though I knew this would be the talk of the town for weeks to come. The once pristine and carefully maintained facade of Karen's life had been shattered in the most literal sense possible. And for the first time since moving into this neighborhood, I felt something I hadn't before, a sense of justice, of balance being restored. I turned back toward my own house, stepping onto my porch, and let out a slow breath. The place where my tree once stood was now an empty space, a scar in the landscape. But strangely, I didn't feel anger anymore. The tree had done what it needed to do. And in the end, it had delivered the kind of justice that no argument, no legal battle, ever could. In the days that followed, the neighborhood remained in a quiet state of shock. Karen's house, once a symbol of pristine perfection, now sat wounded and broken, a reminder of her arrogance. The gaping hole in the roof, the shattered windows, and the crushed fence became an unintentional monument to the consequences of unchecked entitlement. The cleanup crew arrived within 48 hours, workers in bright vests hauling away the massive remains of what used to be my tree. The sight of it being carried off in chunks should have made me angry, but strangely, I felt nothing. The damage was irreversible, and no amount of dwelling on it would bring the tree back. What did linger, however, was the question of what Karen would do next. She had spent years making sure everyone in the neighborhood knew she was in charge, filing complaints over the most insignificant things, ensuring every blade of grass conformed to the standards she had deemed acceptable. But now, she was the one people whispered about. She was the subject of hushed conversations at mailboxes, the reason neighbors gathered in small clusters, shaking their heads. The irony was almost too perfect. Karen herself had become a ghost. She had left the house shortly after the disaster, packing up whatever she could carry in a hurry, and had not been seen since. No morning power walks, no passive-aggressive notes on people's doors, no self-important lectures at HOA meetings. It was as if she had vanished overnight, retreating into whatever hole she had found to lick her wounds. Rumors spread quickly. Some said she was staying at a hotel. Others claimed she had gone to stay with a relative in another state. A few even joked that she had fled the country to escape the embarrassment. But whatever the truth was, one thing was clear: Karen's reign of terror had come to an abrupt and humiliating end. It didn't take long for the official fallout to begin. A week after the incident, HOA officials arrived, clipboards in hand, walking the perimeter of Karen's property, making notes, taking photos, shaking their heads at the level of destruction. The damage was extensive, but it wasn't just structural. Karen had violated multiple property laws, not just by cutting down my tree but by hiring an unlicensed crew to do it. The city had launched an investigation, and from what I overheard, the legal consequences were piling up fast. She was looking at thousands in fines, insurance complications, and a lengthy battle with her own homeowners association, the very organization she had once ruled over with an iron fist. The poetic justice of it all was almost too much to process. It wasn't just the HOA that had turned on her. The neighbors, once too afraid to challenge her authority, had finally found their voices. A few started openly criticizing her in community meetings, sharing stories of how she had made their lives difficult over the years. An older couple down the street admitted they had nearly sold their house just to escape her constant interference. A young family revealed how she had harassed them over their kids playing outside too loudly. Now that Karen had fallen, the stories flowed freely, painting a picture of a woman who had spent years building herself up at the expense of everyone around her. And now, she had lost everything. The transformation of the neighborhood was subtle but noticeable. People who had once kept to themselves were suddenly more open, friendlier. Conversations that had once been stilted and cautious now carried a lighter tone, free from the oppressive weight of Karen's judgment. It was as if the entire block had collectively exhaled a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Even my interactions with the HOA had changed. The same group that had once been quick to enforce her demands was now walking on eggshells, treating me with an almost awkward respect, as if recognizing that they had once been complicit in her rule. Despite everything, part of me wondered if Karen would come back, if she would try to reclaim what she had lost. But as the days stretched into weeks and her house remained abandoned, it became clear that she wasn't returning anytime soon. The damage was too severe, physically, financially, and socially. The house stood empty, a hollow shell of the control she once had, and the longer it stayed that way, the more it became a symbol of her downfall. One evening, as I stood on my porch, watching the last rays of sunlight stretch over the street, I noticed something that caught me off guard. A "for sale" sign had appeared on Karen's front lawn, planted firmly into the dirt like the final nail in the coffin. It wasn't surprising, her reputation in the neighborhood was beyond repair, and the cost of fixing the house was likely more than she was willing to deal with. But still, seeing that sign standing there felt surreal. After years of her presence looming over this place, after all the chaos and tension she had brought, she was truly leaving. And just like that, Karen was gone. The tree may have fallen, but in the end, it had taken her down with it. The weeks passed, and Karen's house remained untouched, its broken windows and crumbling facade a silent testament to her downfall. The "for sale" sign stood firm in the yard, slightly tilted after a recent storm, but no one had come to claim the property. It sat there, empty and lifeless, stripped of the suffocating authority she had once imposed over the neighborhood. The longer it remained unoccupied, the more nature began to reclaim it, grass growing in uneven patches, weeds creeping through the cracks in the driveway, vines twisting around the shattered fence. It was ironic. She had spent years policing the aesthetics of every house on this street, ensuring that not a single lawn grew too wild, not a single fence lost its perfect coat of paint. And now, her own home was the very thing she had spent so much energy trying to prevent, unkempt, neglected, a scar in an otherwise peaceful neighborhood. One morning, as I drank my coffee on the porch, a white van pulled up in front of her house. Two men stepped out, one carrying a clipboard, the other a set of keys. Realtors. They didn't hesitate before making their way up to the front door, unlocking it, and stepping inside. I watched them disappear, the door creaking open like it hadn't been used in ages. A few neighbors took notice too, peeking from behind curtains or stepping out under the pretense of checking their mail, all quietly observing what was happening. No one spoke, but we were all thinking the same thing. Karen's house was finally being sold. Over the next few days, a steady stream of prospective buyers came and went, each walking through the property with that familiar mix of curiosity and caution. Some stayed longer than others, pausing in the backyard where the remains of my tree had once cast its long shadow. Others barely spent 5 minutes inside before stepping back out, shaking their heads, and leaving. The house, for all its grand appearance, carried the weight of what had happened there. It wasn't just damaged in the physical sense. It had a history now, a story etched into its walls, and not everyone was eager to take on that kind of baggage. It took nearly a month before a deal was finalized. I didn't know much about the new owners, only that they were a young couple looking for a fresh start. On the day they moved in, a moving truck pulled up to the curb, and I watched as they unloaded their belongings, stacking boxes in the driveway, chatting casually with the workers helping them. They seemed different from Karen in every possible way. Where she had ruled with an iron grip, they carried an air of warmth, waving at the few neighbors who passed by, exchanging small talk with those who stopped to greet them. It was strange, seeing life return to that house after so many weeks of silence. But it was a good kind of strange. A sign that things were truly changing. Not long after they settled in, the wife, Emily, I later learned, stopped by while I was tending to my yard. She introduced herself, her voice friendly, her posture relaxed. She mentioned how they had heard some stories about the previous owner, how they had been warned that the house came with history. But she laughed it off, saying that every place had its stories, and they weren't the kind to let the past dictate their future. I could respect that. The past had a way of shaping places, leaving its mark, but it didn't have to define what came next. As the weeks rolled on, the neighborhood continued to shift, the scars Karen had left behind slowly fading. The HOA meetings, once filled with tense debates over minor infractions, became actual discussions about improving the community rather than enforcing arbitrary rules. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves started talking more, hosting small gatherings, actually enjoying the homes they had worked so hard to build. The suffocating air of control had lifted, replaced by something lighter, freer. Karen had spent years believing she was the foundation of this neighborhood, the one who kept it all together. But in the end, it was only after she was gone that things truly started to flourish. One evening, as I stood in my yard, staring at the empty patch where my tree had once stood, I thought about how much had changed. I missed the tree, missed its shade, its presence, the history it carried. But I also knew that its fall had set something in motion, something bigger than just broken branches and crushed roofs. It had been the catalyst for something long overdue. And as I turned back toward my house, feeling the cool evening breeze against my skin, I realized something. The tree might have fallen, but in the end, I had won. The neighborhood had won. And for the first time in a long time, everything finally felt right.